The October wind cut through Sarah Mitchell's threadbare shawl like a knife, carrying with it the promise of an early winter that would surely kill them both. She clutched her 6-month-old daughter closer to her chest, feeling the baby's ribs through the thin cotton dress that had once been white, but now bore the stains of their 3-week journey from the failed copper mine that had claimed her husband's life. Cedar Falls trading post squatted against the Montana landscape like a weathered gravestone, its log walls darkened by years of harsh weather and wood smoke. The settlement consisted of little more than the trading post itself, a blacksmith's forge, and a handful of cabins scattered along the creek that gave the place its name. Sarah had walked 18 miles through pine forests and rocky terrain to reach this place, surviving on wild berries and creek water, driven by a desperation that made her stomach clench with something deeper than hunger. Inside the trading post, the air was thick with the smell of tobacco, leather, and unwashed bodies. A handful of rough-looking men clustered around a pot-bellied stove, their conversation dying as Sarah entered. She felt their eyes on her immediately, taking in her hollow cheeks, her patched dress, the way she held her baby like a shield against the world. "Help you, ma'am?" The voice belonged to a heavy-set man behind the counter, his grey beard stained yellow from years of chewing tobacco. His eyes weren't unkind, but they held the wariness of a man who'd seen too much hardship to spare much sympathy. Sarah's throat felt like sandpaper. The words she'd practiced during the long walk suddenly seemed impossible to speak. Baby Emma stirred in her arms, making the soft, mewling sounds that meant she was hungry again. Sarah had no milk left to give. She began, then stopped. The men by the stove were listening now, pretending to warm their hands while their attention focused on her drama. "I need to speak with someone about finding a good home for my daughter." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind outside seemed to pause, as if the whole world was holding its breath. The shopkeeper's face didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. He'd heard this before. "Times are hard for everyone, Ma'am," he said quietly. "But there might be folks willing to take in a child, especially a healthy baby girl. The Andersons over in Millerville lost their youngest to fever last spring. They might—" "I can pay," Sarah interrupted, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Not much, but I have my husband's watch and wedding ring. Gold, real gold." Her voice cracked on the last words. "I just need to know she'll be fed, kept warm, loved." One of the men by the stove cleared his throat uncomfortably. Another muttered something under his breath about hard choices and harder times. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she lifted her chin. She wouldn't be ashamed of trying to save her daughter's life. The bell over the door chimed, and cold air swept through the room as someone entered. Sarah didn't turn around. She was focused on the shopkeeper's face, watching for any sign of hope or condemnation. But she heard heavy boots on the wooden floor, heard the newcomer shake the rain from his coat. "Afternoon, Thomas," the shopkeeper called out. "Didn't expect to see you down from the mountain so early." "Supply run," came the reply, a deep voice roughened by cold air and little use. "Winter's coming hard this year. Can feel it in my bones." Sarah half-turned, catching a glimpse of a tall man in a wool coat, his dark hair damp from the rain that had started falling while she'd been inside. He moved to the counter, but his eyes found her and the baby, and something in his expression made her breath catch. It wasn't pity, exactly, or curiosity. It was recognition, the look of someone who understood loss in a way that couldn't be explained, only lived. Emma chose that moment to begin crying in earnest, her tiny face reddening with the effort. Sarah bounced her gently, making soft shushing sounds, but the baby's cries only grew louder. The sound seemed to fill the entire trading post, echoing off the log walls like an accusation. The tall man, Thomas, set down a list on the counter but didn't look away from Sarah. "Your baby sounds hungry," he said simply. "She is." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "We both are." Chapter 2. An Unexpected Proposition. Thomas Brennan had lived alone on his mountain claim for 2 years, and in that time he'd grown comfortable with silence. The sound of the baby's cries hit him like a physical blow, stirring memories he'd buried deep as winter snow. He saw Margaret in this desperate woman's face, the same hollow-eyed determination, the same fierce protectiveness of a mother trying to save her child. But Margaret hadn't succeeded. Neither had their son. "Jeremiah," Thomas said to the shopkeeper, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest, "why don't you put together my usual order while I have a word with this lady?" Sarah looked up at him with eyes the color of prairie grass, green with flecks of gold that caught the lamplight. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with auburn hair that had once been carefully pinned but now escaped in wisps around her face. The baby in her arms had the same coloring, the same delicate features. "I don't need charity," she said, but there was no real fight in her voice. "I'm trying to do right by my daughter." I heard. Thomas pulled off his hat, running his fingers through his dark hair. "What's your name?" "Sarah Mitchell. This is Emma." She adjusted the baby in her arms, and Thomas noticed how carefully she moved, as if every gesture was calculated to preserve what little strength she had left. "I'm Thomas Brennan. I have a logging claim up the mountain, about 8 miles north of here." He paused, weighing his words. In 2 years of solitude, he'd spoken to maybe a dozen people, and never about anything more personal than the weather or the price of lumber. But something about this woman and her child called to a part of him he'd thought was dead and buried. "I live alone," he continued, "have since my wife and boy died of fever. It's not an easy life, but it's honest work, and the cabin's solid, warm. There's always food on the table." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you saying?" Thomas looked at the baby, who had quieted to soft hiccups. Emma's tiny fist had worked free of her blanket and waved in the air, fingers curled like small flower buds. He remembered his son David at that age, how those same tiny movements had filled him with wonder and terror in equal measure. "I'm saying maybe there's another way," he said. "You need a home for your daughter, and I could use the company, both of you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions. Sarah's green eyes searched his face, looking for deception or worse intentions. Thomas understood her caution. A woman alone with a baby had to be careful of men's offers, especially in country this rough. "You don't know anything about me," she said finally. "I know you walked 18 miles through rough country to try to save your daughter's life," Thomas replied. "I know you're willing to give up the only family you have left to make sure she survives. That tells me what I need to know about your character." Behind them, Jeremiah was making a show of organizing supplies, but Thomas knew the old man was listening to every word. The other men by the stove had grown quiet too, sensing the weight of the moment. Sarah shifted Emma to her other arm, and the movement seemed to pain her. Thomas noticed the way she favored her left side, the careful way she breathed. She was hurt, probably from the long journey, and trying not to show it. "What would you expect from me?" she asked. If we came with you." Thomas had been asking himself the same question since the words left his mouth. He hadn't planned this, hadn't planned anything beyond getting his supplies and heading back to his mountain solitude. But seeing this woman and child had awakened something he thought was gone forever. Help around the cabin, I suppose. Cooking, mending, company during the long winter evenings. He met her eyes directly. "Nothing more than that, if that's what you're worried about. I'm not looking for a wife. I had one, and I loved her true. This would be different. A partnership, maybe. 2 people helping each other survive." Emma made a soft cooing sound, and both adults looked down at her. The baby's eyes were open now, unfocused but alert, and she seemed to be studying Thomas's face with the serious concentration only infants could manage. "She likes you," Sarah said softly, and for the first time Thomas heard something besides desperation in her voice. Hope, maybe, or just exhaustion so deep it felt like hope. "Children always did take to me," Thomas admitted. "My David used to fall asleep on my chest while I read by the fire. Margaret said he knew I was safe." The memory came without the usual knife-sharp pain, which surprised him. Sarah looked around the trading post, at the rough men watching their drama unfold, at Jeremiah pretending not to listen, at the narrow window that showed the grey sky and the first fat snowflakes beginning to fall. "Winter's coming," she said, more to herself than to him. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "It'll be a hard one. But my cabin's got a good stove, and I laid in wood all summer. There's a root cellar stocked with preserves and salt pork, room enough for 3 if we're careful about it." The baby began to fuss again, and Sarah's face tightened with worry. Thomas made a decision that surprised him with its swiftness. "Jeremiah," he called to the shopkeeper, "add some milk powder to my order, and whatever else a baby might need for the winter." Sarah's head snapped up. "I can't pay you back. Not right away." "I'm not asking you to." Thomas put his hat back on, settling it low against the weather. "I'm asking if you want to come home with me, Sarah Mitchell. Both of you, before this snow gets worse." Outside, the wind howled like something wild and hungry, and the first real storm of winter began to paint the world white. Chapter 3. The Journey Home. The snow was falling harder by the time Thomas loaded his supplies into the back of his wagon, each flake fat and heavy with the promise of a long winter. Sarah sat beside him on the wooden bench, Emma bundled in a new wool blanket that Jeremiah had thrown in for the baby's sake. The shopkeeper's gruff kindness had surprised her, but she was learning that frontier people showed care in practical ways rather than pretty words. "It's about 2 hours to my place," Thomas said, clicking his tongue to get the horses moving. "Maybe 3 with this weather. You warm enough?" Sarah nodded, though the wind cut through her thin shawl like it was made of paper. Thomas had offered her his coat, but she'd refused. He was already doing more than enough. The motion of the wagon was oddly soothing after weeks of walking, and Emma had finally fallen asleep against her chest, lulled by the rhythmic creak of wheels and the soft snorting of the horses. They rode in silence for the first mile, the only sounds the whisper of snow against canvas and the steady clop of hooves on the muddy trail. Sarah found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. Thomas Brennan was probably in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of hard work and the patient eyes of someone who'd learned to find peace in solitude. He handled the horses with quiet competence, his movements economical and sure. "You don't have to do this," she said finally, the words torn away by the wind almost before they left her lips. Thomas was quiet for so long, she thought he hadn't heard her. Then, "My Margaret died on a day like this. November snow coming down so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The fever had her delirious, and she kept asking me to take David outside to play in the snow." His voice was steady, but Sarah heard the old pain underneath it. "I kept promising her we would once she got better, but she never did get better." Sarah felt something clench in her chest. How old was David? 2.5. Old enough to know his mama was sick, but too young to understand why she couldn't hold him anymore. Thomas guided the horses around a fallen branch, his movements automatic. He lasted 3 days after she went. Just gave up, I think. Sometimes I wonder if he knew something I didn't. The snow was getting heavier, and Sarah could feel it beginning to accumulate on Emma's blanket. She brushed it away with gentle fingers, marveling at how peaceful her daughter looked despite everything they'd been through. "Why did you offer to help us?" she asked. "Really?" Thomas was quiet again, and Sarah thought she'd pushed too far, but then he said, "Because I know what it's like to watch someone you love slip away while you stand there helpless, and maybe this time I can do something about it." The trail began to climb, winding through pine forest so thick that the snow seemed to muffle even the sound of their breathing. Sarah had never seen country so wild, so empty of human presence. Back in Colorado, where she and her husband had tried their luck at the copper mine, there had at least been other families, other voices to break the silence. Here she felt like they were traveling to the edge of the world. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked. "Every day," Thomas admitted. "But lonely's better than some alternatives. At least when you're alone, you can't disappoint anyone but yourself." Sarah understood that feeling better than she cared to admit. Since her husband James had died in the mine collapse, she'd felt like she was failing at everything. Failing to grieve properly, failing to provide for Emma, failing to be the kind of mother her daughter deserved. Maybe that was why Thomas's offer had seemed like a lifeline rather than charity. He wasn't asking her to be grateful or perfect. He was just asking her to survive. The cabin appeared through the snow like something from a fairy tale, though there was nothing magical about its sturdy log construction and practical design. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line before the wind caught it and scattered it among the pines. A covered porch ran along the front, and Sarah could see neat stacks of firewood arranged under the eaves. Everything about the place spoke of careful preparation and solitary competence. "It's not much," Thomas said, pulling the wagon up to the porch steps, "but it's solid. Built it myself after I came up here." "It's beautiful," Sarah said, and meant it. The cabin looked like safety felt, warm and permanent and utterly reliable. Chapter 4. Finding Shelter. Inside, the cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a smaller bedroom, and a loft that Thomas explained he used for storage. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, throwing dancing shadows across hand-hewn furniture, and shelves lined with books. Sarah hadn't expected the books, leather-bound volumes that suggested education and careful thought. "How you can have the bedroom," Thomas said, setting down her small bundle of possessions near the door. "I'll sleep out here by the fire. It's warmer anyway, and I'm used to it. Sarah wanted to protest. It was his home after all. But Emma was beginning to stir, and she could feel her own exhaustion pulling at her like a tide. The warmth of the cabin was making her realize just how cold she'd been for so long. "There's a wash basin and pitcher in the bedroom," Thomas continued, moving around the cabin with the easy familiarity of someone who'd arranged every stick of furniture himself. "I'll heat some water for you. And there's some of Margaret's things still in the chest. Dresses and such. They might fit you." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Sarah wasn't sure she understood. Wearing a dead woman's clothes felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. But her own dress was barely holding together, and winter was coming whether she was ready or not. "Thank you," she said quietly. I'll take good care of them." Thomas nodded, then busied himself building up the fire and setting a kettle to boil. Sarah stood in the middle of the main room, Emma in her arms, and tried to process the fact that they were safe, actually safe, for the first time since James had died. The thought was so overwhelming she had to sit down hard in one of the wooden chairs. "When did you last eat a real meal?" Thomas asked, not looking up from the stove where he was starting something that smelled like heaven. Sarah tried to remember. 3 days ago, maybe 4. There was a farmhouse. The woman gave us some soup and bread. She'd paid for it with her wedding ring, but she didn't mention that. Some sacrifices were too personal to share, even with someone who was offering shelter. "Well, you'll eat tonight, and tomorrow, and every day after that, as long as you're here." Thomas glanced over at her, and something in his expression made her chest tight. "You don't have to decide anything right now, Sarah. Just rest. Get your strength back. Winter's long up here, and there's time to figure things out." Emma began to fuss, the particular cry that meant she was hungry. Sarah felt the familiar stab of anxiety. She had so little milk left, and the baby needed more than she could give. But Thomas was already moving, mixing something in a cup with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "Milk powder and warm water," he explained, testing the temperature on his wrist. "It's not the same as what she's used to, but it'll keep her fed and growing." He handed Sarah the cup and a small spoon, then tactfully turned his attention back to the stove while she fed her daughter. Emma took to the makeshift formula eagerly, her tiny hands grasping at the spoon as if she understood that this was salvation in liquid form. "She's beautiful," Thomas said softly, still not looking directly at them. "Looks like her mother." "She has her father's stubbornness," Sarah replied, surprised to find herself almost smiling. "James used to say she'd argue with the angels if she got the chance." "Stubbornness keeps people alive out here," Thomas said. "She'll need it." As Emma ate, Sarah looked around the cabin with new eyes. The furniture was simple but well made, obviously crafted by someone who took pride in his work. The books on the shelves ranged from practical manuals on farming and animal husbandry to volumes of poetry and philosophy. A guitar hung on one wall, its wood worn smooth by years of handling. "You play?" she asked, nodding toward the instrument. "Used to. Margaret loved music, said it made the cabin feel less empty." Thomas stirred whatever he was cooking, and the smell made Sarah's stomach clench with hunger. "Haven't touched it much since." "Maybe you should," Sarah said, then immediately regretted the presumption. Who was she to suggest how this man should handle his grief? But Thomas just looked thoughtful. Maybe. Might be nice to have music in the house again. Outside, the wind was picking up, driving the snow against the windows in patterns that looked like frost flowers. Sarah could hear the pines creaking and swaying, their voices joining the storm's song. But inside the cabin, with the fire crackling and Emma finally content in her arms, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. "Peace, Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you really doing this?" He turned from the stove, and in the firelight his face looked younger, more vulnerable. "Because I couldn't save them," he said simply. "Margaret and David. I tried everything. Prayers, medicine, promises I couldn't keep. But maybe I can save you, both of you. Maybe that's enough." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since James's death. "What if I'm not worth saving?" "Everyone's worth saving," Thomas said, and the certainty in his voice made her believe it might actually be true. "The question is whether you're willing to let someone try." Emma had finished eating and was beginning to drowse against Sarah's shoulder. The baby's trust was absolute. She had no doubt that she was safe, fed, and loved. Sarah envied that certainty, but for the first time in months, she thought she might be able to find it again. "Yes," she whispered, so quietly she wasn't sure Thomas heard her over the wind. Yes, I'm willing to try. Chapter 5. Home. 3 months later, the mountain was buried under 4 feet of snow, and Sarah Mitchell had learned to call Thomas Brennan's cabin home. The learning hadn't been easy. There had been nights when she'd lain awake in Margaret's bed, wearing Margaret's dress, wondering if she was trying to fill a space that could never truly be filled. There had been days when Thomas barely spoke, lost in memories she couldn't reach, and there had been moments when Emma's cries echoed too loudly in the small space, reminding them both of other children, other losses. But there had also been mornings when Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and pancakes, and Thomas humming while he worked. There had been evenings when he'd taken down the guitar and played soft melodies, while Emma fell asleep in Sarah's arms. There had been the gradual accumulation of small kindnesses, Thomas teaching Sarah to read his books, Sarah mending his shirts with careful stitches, both of them learning to move around each other in the confined space without stepping on old wounds. Today, Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas split firewood in the grey February light. His movements were economical and sure, the axe rising and falling in a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing. Emma sat propped in the wooden high chair Thomas had carved for her, babbling contentedly at a rag doll Sarah had sewn from scraps of Margaret's old apron. The baby had thrived through the winter, growing plump and healthy on milk powder and mashed vegetables from Thomas's root cellar. She'd learned to sit up, to reach for things with purpose, to smile at Thomas in a way that made his entire face soften. Sometimes Sarah caught him talking to Emma while he thought she wasn't listening, telling her about the birds at the feeder, or the way snow crystals formed, or how her mother was the bravest woman he'd ever known. "Mama," Emma said suddenly, clear as a bell, and Sarah nearly dropped the plate she was washing. "Did you hear that?" Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face flushed from the cold, eyes bright with excitement. She said, "Mama." "She's been practicing," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. But inside her heart was singing. After months of feeling like she was failing at everything, Emma's first word felt like absolution. Thomas hung his coat on the peg by the door and crossed to the high chair where Emma immediately reached for him with chubby arms. "What about Papa, little one? Can you say, Papa?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Over the months she'd watched Thomas with Emma, patient, gentle, protective in a way that spoke of instinctive love rather than obligation. She'd seen how his face lit up when the baby laughed, how he carved toys for her with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. But hearing him ask for that particular word made the arrangement they'd all been pretending was temporary suddenly feel very real. "Papa," Emma said experimentally, and Thomas's face went completely still. "Did she just—" His voice was barely a whisper. "She knows who takes care of her," Sarah said softly, "who keeps her safe, who loves her." She paused, then added with quiet certainty, "who her papa is." Thomas looked at Sarah then, really looked at her, and she saw years of careful distance crumble in his eyes. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. These past months, I haven't just been helping you survive. You've been helping me live again. You and Emma both." Sarah set down the dish towel and moved closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Thomas, I know this wasn't what either of us planned," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "I know we both loved other people, and we both carry scars from losing them. But what we've built here, it's real, it's good, and I don't want it to end when spring comes." Emma chose that moment to clap her hands and laugh, as if she understood the weight of the moment and approved. Both adults looked at her, then at each other, and Sarah felt something unlock in her chest that had been closed since James died. "I used to think love was something that happened once," she said slowly, "that if you lost it, you were done. But living here with you, watching you with Emma, I've learned that the heart is bigger than I thought. There's room for old love and new love both." Thomas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "I'll never forget Margaret and David, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life mourning them either. I want to live with you, with Emma, if you'll have me." Sarah thought of the woman she'd been 3 months ago, desperate, broken, ready to give away the most precious thing she had just to keep it alive. She thought of the journey that had brought her to this cabin, this man, this moment. It hadn't been the life she'd planned, but maybe that was the point. Maybe the best things couldn't be planned, only discovered. "I love you, Thomas Brennan," she said, and the words felt like coming home. "We both do." He kissed her then, soft and careful, as if she were something precious that might break. But Sarah was done being fragile. She'd walked through fire and snow and desperation, and she'd emerged stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. "Mama, Papa," Emma announced from her high chair, clapping her hands with the joy of someone who understood that her world was complete. Outside, the wind still howled through the pines, and snow continued to fall on the mountain that had become their sanctuary. But inside the cabin, 3 people who had found each other against all odds sat down to share a simple meal, and called it abundance. Thomas picked up his guitar that evening for the first time since Sarah and Emma had arrived. The melody he played was new, not the sad songs of memory he'd carried for 2 years, but something hopeful and forward-looking, something that sounded like family. Sarah held Emma in the rocking chair Thomas had made from pine logs and listened to the music fill the spaces between them. The baby's eyes were heavy with sleep, but she fought to stay awake, as if she knew this was a moment worth remembering. "What will we tell her when she's older?" Sarah asked. "About how we all found each other." Thomas looked up from the guitar, his eyes soft in the firelight. "We'll tell her the truth," he said, "that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the hardest ground, that love isn't always what you expect, but it's always what you need, and that home isn't a place, it's the people who choose to build a life together, one day at a time." Emma finally surrendered to sleep, her tiny fist curled against Sarah's chest. Outside, the storm was beginning to quiet, and through the window, Sarah could see the first stars appearing between the clouds. Spring would come eventually, bringing new challenges and new possibilities. But for now, in this moment, they had everything they needed. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to Thomas, though the words felt inadequate for everything he'd given them. "Thank you," he replied, and she understood. They'd saved each other, all 3 of them, in ways that couldn't be measured or repaid. They'd taken broken pieces and made something whole, something beautiful, something that would last. In the morning, Sarah would wake to find Thomas already up, stoking the fire and starting breakfast. Emma would babble happily in her crib, reaching for the sunlight streaming through frost-covered windows. And Sarah would realize with a joy so complete it took her breath away that she was no longer just surviving. She was home.